52. The Anvil's mice. The image would have appealed to me in the past. It suggests a swarm of sparks decimated in its own lightning flash. The anvil is cold, the iron not red hot, the imagination aghast.
On June 10th, 4 days before France fell, Mussolini entered the war. He had waited until that moment to make his decision. And now the Nazis entered Paris. This had been the dream of the Kaiser in the last war. Hitler achieved it.
In the summer of 1942, Germany expanded its hold over France by pouring its military presence into the southern regions. As the war progressed, the Allies formulated plans for 2 invasions that would free France and push the Nazis back. The plan was to land an invasion in Normandy, and support it with a second invasion from the southern coast. These were Operations Overlord and Anvil, but the latter was scrapped in favor of a major invasion of Normandy. However, a variation of the Anvil operation ended up being deployed as Dragoon, and an invasion force pushed through Provence to supply the Normandy forces. The liberation of France was carefully planned using intelligence provided by the French resistance. Groups of resistance fighters provided the Allies with information on German movement and orchestrated the delivery of supplies and troops to operators in the south prior to liberation. These groups were led by men like Captain Alexander, whose men engaged in sabotage and helped supply the Allies by creating an airfield in Vaucluse and retrieving covert airdrops in the Durance region.
The cylinders swinging from their multicolored silks got scattered over an enormous area. We battled for hours in an infernal glare, splitting up into 3 groups. One lot fighting the fire, doing what they could with axes and spades. A second lot gone off in a search of stray arms and explosives, bringing them to the waiting truck. A third providing us with cover. From the tops of pines, panicking squirrels leapt like tiny comets into the blaze. As for the enemy, we just managed to avoid him. Dawn crept up on us before he did.
Captain Alexander and his men were based largely in the town of Serest, where he kept a journal of his experiences. This journal returned to him after the war, after someone retrieved it from a hole in the wall of the building in which he had hidden it. Captain Alexander pulled 237 fragments from his journal and compiled them to be published under his real name, René Carr. Carr already had critical acclaim as a poet prior to the war, but his compiled French list gained renown. The poetry included anecdotes from the war and his exploration of the dark events and emotions he experienced.
He reminded me of a dead partridge, poor invalid who, after being stripped of the few rags he possessed, was murdered by the militia of Varsha, who accused him of harboring partisans. Before finishing him off, the gangsters enjoyed themselves at great length with the girl who was part of the expedition. With one eye torn out and his chest stoved in, the innocent man took in this hell and their laughter. We have captured the girl.
Poetry and trauma enjoy a very curious relationship, one which enables authors to sort out their own experiences and order them into something they can digest.
Healing from trauma, psychological trauma, in particular, if talking about your trauma, bringing it to mind and being able to express it and turn it into a narrative is how one deals with trauma.
I love my country more than anyone could know, yet I am hardly ever in that beautiful place. I can't remember the sight of drifting snow, but I cannot forget my victim's face. I am gentle and slow to anger. I am calloused by fear and by gore. As I have said, I am a soldier. I will always and forever be at war.
So I'm currently still in the military. I've been in about just under 15 years now. I started writing during deployments as kind of like journal entries, it was a way for me to find a release from everything going on. I was dealing with being on my own for the first time, being in a new place. There was a lot of excitement, a lot of fear, a lot of unknowns. So just letting words spill out without any kind of structure or having to worry about an audience or anything else, kind of took something that was abstract and kind of chaotic, gave it a little bit of form.
Having twice put him conclusively to the test, I have no trouble convincing myself that the thief who has somehow slipped into our midst is beyond redemption. A pimp, he even boasts about it, spiteful in the extreme, going to pieces before the enemy, wallowing in the horrors he reports, like a pig and awful. Nothing to look forward to, other than the most serious troubles from this runaway slave. Likely, moreover, to introduce a vile fluid here. I will do the thing myself.
René Carr was an experienced poet who was likely very aware of the medium's value in understanding and expressing complex emotions. That value comes from literary techniques that allow authors to create writing that creatively mirrors experiences that can't be expressed in direct language. This equips the author not only with the ability to communicate to the reader, but also to better understand their own situations.
By the time I got to writing poetry, I think it was for the more extreme things that were happening. I think it helped me to kind of understand it a little bit more.
One of the things that's fascinated me about poetry used to respond to violence is precisely all of these tools of poetry that narrative doesn't have, right? Particularly, and as I mentioned, imagery, onomatopoeia, metaphor, any kind of figurative language. Those are tools that I think people who have been through traumatic events and write poetry find these tools very useful to describe how it is that they experience the event, much more so than narrative.
René certainly leans into more surreal explorations of his inner atmosphere, employing heavy imagery and literary elements to his advantage. For example, he expresses himself in Fragment 43, writing,
Mouth, which used to decide if this was mourning or marriage, poison or potion, sickness or beauty. What has become of bitterness and tenderness? It's dawn. Hideous head, grown irritable and corrupt.
There are some people who make the argument that when you look at the play Ajax, or you look at some of Achilles' speeches in the Iliad, that certainly the ancient Greeks knew about trauma. In fact, there's an interesting article written by Jonathan Shea saying that all of those plays were produced in a theater where all the men watching the plays were themselves war veterans. And so the plays were a form of healing, a form of trauma processing, but not that they knew that, not that they were doing it purposefully. It's just something that happened naturally.
The ancient Greeks were working through their traumas in what seems to be a natural, almost instinctual process, turning experiences into narrative and exploring them by employing poetic devices. Perhaps it was instinct that drove Carr to continue his poetry during war, recording what must have been the darkest parts of many people's lives and turning them into pieces of literature that possess a frightening and sometimes saddening familiarity.
I think with each successive deployment and experience, I was able to draw on previous experiences and with new perspective.
Poetry is got a special language of imagery, onomatopoeia, and metaphor that allows us to express that trauma. We also need to do what poetry does best, which is to give a very complex understanding of human nature. And this is really important, poetry should always surprise people. Poetry should always hit people with a sense of, I never thought of it that way.
War poetry serves well to record events and explore them emotionally, but as a genre, it serves a much higher purpose, one of healing and understanding. As trauma and PTSD continue to be researched and understood by the general public, our understanding of poetry's intimacy and relevance to our daily lives deepens.
In the darkness of our lives, there is not one place for beauty. The whole place is for beauty.